Floyd Mayweather might be the most influential boxer of all time, but his impact may have ruined the sport. What if I were to tell you that modern day boxing politics and the delay of super fights, the way boxing is structured with boxers being at the center and them getting paid so much money, undefeated records being prioritized by young fighters, the decline of young fans being attracted to boxing, and boxing getting its infamous label as boring, and YouTube boxing was all caused by one man, Floyd "Money" Mayweather Jr. In this video, I'm going to explore Floyd Mayweather's impact on the sport of boxing and how it has directly impacted the state of modern day boxing. And before I begin this video, I just want to preface by saying I am not a Floyd Mayweather hater. I know, it might look bad, but I completely respect Floyd Mayweather. He is one of the greatest to ever do it, and I respect what he has done for the sport, but his lasting impact has completely changed boxing as we know it, some of it good and some of it bad. And in this video, I would argue mostly bad. But let's get into it. So starting off with a pretty easy one, the recent influx of undefeated records, especially by new up-and-coming stars, is a definite direct result of Floyd Mayweather's impact. So as you may know, Floyd Mayweather is undefeated, and he is most famously known for being 50-0. And through these 50 competitors, he has seen some of the toughest competition, to Hall of Famers, to all-time greats, and everything in between. It can be argued he didn't take these fighters at their absolute prime and may have delayed these fights, but what can't be argued is his promotional advantage and strength as being an undefeated fighter. Basically, every Floyd Mayweather fight followed the same formula of having his undefeated record being the center of the promotional campaign. Promotional trailers of the fight would always talk about how he was undefeated. He had t-shirts, fight posters, and hats displaying his current record at the time of that fight. And again, everybody wanted to tune in and see how long he could keep up this undefeated record. And obviously, with the success that came with promoting one's undefeated record, it didn't take long for other promotions to try to replicate the success Floyd Mayweather had by trying to manufacture undefeated records. I go much more in depth in my other previous video about too many undefeated records in boxing and how they're made, but basically Floyd Mayweather opened the floodgates for so many other promotions to manufacture undefeated records and to promote those boxers. I mean, look at the pound for pound rankings in 2004. Practically everybody had at least 2 losses, and the only person who was undefeated in this list was obviously Floyd Mayweather. Now, if you take a look at the rankings today, only 3 boxers within the top 10 have 1 or more loss, and no boxer within the top 10 has more than 2 losses. Now, I'm not going to crunch the specific numbers, but if you scroll up from 2004 all the way to today's pound for pound rankings in 2022, you can clearly see the quantity of zeros going up, and the major constant between 2004 and 2022 is Floyd Mayweather being in the top of those pound for pound lists. Now, this next part might be a little controversial and might ruffle some feathers, especially with Mayweather fans. But again, I want to stress that I am not a Floyd Mayweather hater, and I have come to appreciate his style and his defensive skill and his skills in general. As somebody who practices boxing in real life, Mayweather is one of my most watched fighters, especially when I want to get better and more skilled. But let's be brutally honest, Mayweather's style is definitely not exciting or appeasing to the casual fan who wants to see volume punching, knockouts, and highlight finishes. At the height of his career and Money Mayweather era, from 2007 following his Oscar De La Hoya fight all the way up to right before 2017 with his fight against Conor McGregor, he only had 2 finishes, and one of them was, let's just say, needed an asterisk next to it. So he really, in my eyes, only had 1 legitimate finish. So for a vast part of this decade, from 2007 to 2017, he seldom finished his fights, and for a majority of his wins were won via decision. And because Floyd Mayweather at this point was the face of boxing and definitely was the cash cow, for a majority of fans, he was seen as almost like the ambassador of boxing. And what I mean by ambassador here is that Floyd Mayweather, for a majority of casual fans, was the only boxer they would tune into, so whatever Floyd Mayweather did and how he finished his fights was essentially the perception of boxing to those casual fans. And obviously this seems unfair, as during the time there were a lot of exciting fighters and power punchers, but because Floyd Mayweather was essentially the main representative of the sport of boxing, most casual fans would see boxing as kind of boring and more technical and less likely to produce some of the highlight finishes, because Floyd Mayweather didn't really produce highlight finishes. And this may have led to casual fans giving boxing the label of boring or an old man sport. Now, this next point might be Floyd Mayweather's most important change to the sport of boxing, and it's really hard to say if this change was completely good or completely bad, as there's a lot of positives that came with this change and there's a lot of negatives that came with this change. What I'm talking about is how Floyd Mayweather completely changed the structure of the business of boxing and shifted most, if not all, of the power to the boxer from the promotions and managers. Now, obviously, boxers have always been the stars of boxing, but when it came to the business side, promoters and managers usually handled that. And due to this, boxers before Floyd Mayweather's time weren't seeing the insane paychecks that we're seeing now. And yes, it was first the Muhammad Ali Act that made it possible for this power shift from managers or promoters to go to boxers, but it really wasn't until Floyd Mayweather taking full advantage of this act that it showed boxers that they had a lot of negotiating power when it came to their contracts and revenue. This couldn't be more evident when in 2006, Floyd Mayweather would buy out his own contract for $750,000. From this point on, Mayweather would promote himself through Mayweather Promotions and essentially be free of other promoters controlling his contracts and his share of the revenue. And I'll link this ESPN article in the description below, but it is a great showcase to show how powerful and controlling Mayweather was during contract negotiations or negotiations regarding the split of revenue. This really showed that Mayweather was able to aggressively negotiate for the biggest cut of the revenue, and he kind of set this precedent that if he didn't get his money, then he would just delay the fight. Because he was both the main draw to an event and also its main promoter, he didn't have to come to any compromises when it came to negotiations, because the event solely relied on Floyd Mayweather. Now, I don't think any modern boxer today has that type of control Mayweather had back in the day when he was both the star of boxing and promoted himself. But like Undefeated Records, boxers today will try to replicate that success Mayweather had and will aggressively negotiate contracts because they've seen through Floyd Mayweather's actions that they do have a lot of power when it comes to the negotiating table. They are the main draw to the event, and this event is not possible without them, so they will use this as leverage to negotiate as much money as possible. Now, this is where the weird gray area comes into play, like I said in the beginning of this point, because this isn't necessarily good or necessarily bad. The good news is that boxers get huge paydays at the end of the day, and they get a lot of money, and the money that most fans think they deserve. But the negative is that a lot of the super fights and the fights that the fans want to see get delayed or don't happen at all. The funny thing is, right after I made this clip, Anthony Joshua announced that his team agreed to the terms of Tyson Fury to fight in December. And I was glad I was proven wrong in this one, but it was kind of funny that it happened literally right after I recorded. Before the Floyd Mayweather era, boxing stars hard bargaining and negotiating their contracts, which would subsequently delay super fights, was practically unimaginable, and this is why we saw so many boxing stars in their prime fight each other so often. But after the Floyd Mayweather era and what he did to the sport of boxing, most star fighters feel entitled to negotiate as much money as possible, and they don't really care if the fights get delayed and the fans miss out on an incredible fight, because Floyd Mayweather was able to do it and get so much money. Rarely do you see today modern fighters taking pay cuts or compromises to make fights happen. And finally, we come to the most contentious point, which is that Floyd Mayweather's impact led to YouTube boxing. Now, this one is definitely less obvious than the other points brought up in this video, but I think when Floyd Mayweather decided to fight Conor McGregor and this became one of the biggest pay-per-view events of all time, it's hard to deny that this event had a huge impact on the start of the YouTube boxing scene we see today. When Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor took over the world with their fight in 2017, fans were captivated by not only the fight itself, but the hype surrounding the fight, such as the press conferences, the trash talking, and the personalities of these fighters. This historical fight took place on August 2017, and just 6 months later, KSI and Joe Weller would fight and kickstart the YouTube boxing scene we see today. And you can't tell me the build-up between Joe Weller and KSI wasn't heavily influenced by the build-up of Conor McGregor and Floyd Mayweather. From the trash talking, to the large press conferences, to the spectacle of the whole event, This was definitely a byproduct of the Conor McGregor-Floyd Mayweather fight. Even Floyd Mayweather would participate in one of these YouTube boxing events when he fought Logan Paul, and helped this become a staple of pop culture we see today. I think ultimately what Conor McGregor versus Mayweather showed is that the matchups that sell are between two big personalities and not necessarily a matchup of equal skill or a matchup that is necessarily competitive. So what do you guys think? Is Floyd Mayweather's impact on boxing good or bad or somewhere in between? It's very hard to say if his impact on boxing was good or not, but it's hard to argue that he wasn't one of the most impactful boxers of all time. So thanks for watching. Again, please keep it civil in the comments, and I'll continue to upload weekly. Peace.